fraud, corruption, police raids, and a failed ERP implementation. Those things don't sound like they go together, but that actually does go together. And what we're going to discuss here today in today's live stream, we're going to talk about a $1 billion ERP failure and some of the follow-up activity that has resulted from that at SAAQ, which is the Auto Insurance Board in Quebec, Canada. We're going to dive into this case here today. It's turning into quite the debacle, and it's a lot of really interesting information that's coming out of it, and a lot of good lessons learned. And that's what we want to talk about here today. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting, and we're an independent and tech agnostic consulting firm that helps clients with their digital transformation journeys. And joining me today is a panel discussion of a group of different experts that I thought could help us unpack this concept or this case in more detail from a number of different lenses. So joining us on this panel, I'll introduce each here in a moment, but we've got a lawyer, we've got a consultant, we've got an industry analyst, and we have a government CIO. So we're trying to get the perspective here of 4 different perspectives and trying to unpack what's going on here in this case. But just to real quickly set the stage, I'll give you the real high-level summary of what's happening at SAAQ in Canada. It's a government entity. It's basically a government agency that handles auto insurance and other related services for citizens in Quebec area. They recently went to implement SAP with IBM. Their original budget was somewhere between $500 and $600 million Canadian dollars. Ended up being over $1 billion, and they still have nothing to show for it. And that was already interesting enough right there, in my opinion. That right there is a case study to talk about. But then it gets more interesting. Last week, at the time we're recording this, the anti-corruption group within the Quebec government actually raided their offices, and they're collecting documentation and trying to find evidence of possible corruption. So there's a whole nother layer there. That's almost sounds like we're doing a gossip pop culture sort of discussion here, but it's actually related to enterprise technology, strangely enough. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about this big failure, what some of the lessons and takeaways are, and what we can do and what you can do as organizations to ensure that you're avoiding some of these same problems. So joining us here is several different guests, and I'm actually one thing I did just realize is I have the wrong. I can't change it now. I was going to change the formatting of the screen, but I can't do it now since we're live. But I'm going to introduce our guests here. Starting with you, Scott. And actually, just to set the stage for Scott. I actually read this article on Friday. One of our team members forwarded me an article from CIO magazine about this recent development in the case as far as the police raids and the potential anti-corruption. And I was reading the article, and I saw Scott's name mentioned in the article, and he had a couple quotes in there. And I know Scott, and I know his company, Infotech. So Scott, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Eric. Scott Bickley, an advisory fellow at Infotech Research Group. We basically in our practice cover vendor management, contract review, mega vendors from a commercial licensing implementation perspective.
Great. Good. Great to have you here today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here. And then Ron Pucciolini, the government CIO perspective is why you're here. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Ron.
Thank you, Eric. My name is Ron Pucciolini. I'm government CIO with 25 plus years experience. I've also got 20 some years experience in the private sector at the same levels and below her. Seems like I've been doing ERP implementations pretty much my entire career. So this one hit really close to home. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you for being here. And Ron is actually a 2-time client of ours at Third Stage. And you would think after being a 2-time client, I would say Ron Pucciolini instead of Ron Pucciolini. But I still have a mental block about your name being Ron Pucciolini, so I apologize for that.
Call me anything but late for dinner.
Good. All right. So Fred Hessler from the Third Stage team, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Eric. Fred Hessler. I'm a director in Third Stage's expert witness practice, where I focus on litigation support and project interventions and retrospectives. I've got about a 40-year career in enterprise software, 32 years in various consulting roles.
Great. Thanks for being here. And then and you also do project recoveries too, in addition to expert witness. So you have that perspective of how to clean up some of these projects. So that'll be a great lens that we can analyze this case through. And then last but not least, Marcus Harris, the attorney side of things. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Marcus.
Yeah, well, my name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney. I've been drafting and negotiating software-related agreements, implementation-related contracts in litigating failed ERP projects in courts across the country for over 20 years. And I like to say that I've seen everything, but I certainly haven't seen something exactly like this. And I think this one takes the cake, and it's a little bit shocking and unusual. So I'm excited to talk about this today.
Yeah, it is very shocking and unusual, and I haven't seen anything like it either. Just when you think you've seen the craziest of the crazy, you end up seeing a case like this.
Yeah.
So, and I gave you a quick backdrop. And by the way, I usually do this at the very beginning, but I'd love to hear from the audience where you're joining from today. So if you don't mind dropping in the chat what city or country you're joining from, it's always great to hear what community you're joining from. And also if you're in Quebec, I would love to hear that in particular too, because I'd love to hear how this has impacted you potentially, or sort of boots on the ground. How has this affected the average citizen in the Quebec area? Because it's more than just sounds like it's more than just an ERP failure. It's more than just corruption. It's also, how does this affect people at the end of the day? So drop in the chat if you don't mind what city and country you're joining from. And by the way, I was going to play a fun little game too, maybe just to get things started before I get into the meat of this. For some of the promos we put out for this event, I was using the line, "Send lawyers, guns, and money," because it sort of stuck in my head. But there's a quote from a song that I love that says, "Send lawyers, guns, and money. The shit has hit the fan." And that, I don't know why that just popped in my head as soon as I read this article, but I'd love to hear if anyone knows who the artist is that created that quote or that lyric. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the chat below.
That's Warren Zevon. Oh, sorry. Oh,
give it away, Fred.
The audience. Sorry.
All right. Well, tell us in the chat if you've heard the song "Lawyers, Guns, and Money" from Warren Zevon. It's a great song, and it just literally, as soon as I read this article, that's the song that popped in my head: is "Send lawyers, guns, and money." All right, so we've got a lot of people chiming in here and where they're joining from, and I'll get to that here in just a second, and as well as anyone else who might have heard that Warren Zevon song. But I want to start with you, Scott, here for just a second. This whole panel, by the way, has read the articles about this, the public articles, and we've actually read an auditor's report. So the Quebec government did an audit of the project a few months ago just to see what went wrong and figure out how this got so out of hand and how taxpayer money was mismanaged this badly. And the whole premise of it was not only to fix that project, but to figure out for other modernization efforts throughout Quebec, how could they avoid the same fates? So we got the full report from the auditors that did it. It was in French. We had to translate it because none of us speak French, and we've read the whole thing. So when you read all the details that we have about this case so far, Scott, and you were quoted in the article, the CIO article that mentioned this case more recently, what was your initial reaction? Was there anything that surprised you about this whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the scope and scale of this particular project failure was what struck me most dramatically. I mean, we're not unaccustomed to seeing large, complex, ERP related projects, especially in the public sector where the scrutiny is quite high. Those failures, get the limelight on them. I don't think we hear about the successes, nearly as much. So something goes live and it works, you tend to just go on with life. But that being said, I mean, I think there is a trend here with, when you're talking about projects of this scale, 9 figures plus, and high complexity. And, first thing that struck me was just the complete lack of preparation and due diligence in terms of investment and time and money to prepare for this. This is a bespoke, highly customized project. Seemingly, looking at the vendors involved, I was kind of scratching my head saying, are those platforms right for this type of functionality? There was a lot of things that immediately struck me as being off. So I think once it progressed past those initial stages, there were still multiple points in the process where this train could have been stopped before it completely went off the tracks, and it just went every chance there was to stop the train and to keep this thing from falling apart. It just was moved forward and moved forward and moved forward, and I think that's where we will eventually get into kind of project dysfunction morphed into ethical issues and kind of the corruption aspect, if you will.
Yeah. Good point. And so, Ron, coming to you from the perspective of a CIO who's been through these transformations before, I mean, could you imagine anything like this happening on your watch, or if it were developing on your watch, what's your reaction to this whole thing?
knock on wood, I've not had to do this personally. I have had to come in and clean a few of these up, not at this scale. That's always a lot of work as well. But I think the thing that jumped out at me to follow on with what Scott was saying is we've been hearing these same threads were specifically related to ERP type solutions and digital transitions in general of why are you trying to what I call boil the ocean? Let's break it into smaller pieces. It's easier, it's less risk. We got to do the upfront preparation. You got to invest in looking at your processes before you try and automate your processes. Otherwise, you're just automating garbage, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
All of which seems to have contributed to the challenges that Quebec faced. I think the biggest thing that caught my attention was, if I remember the numbers correctly, something like a 560 plus day delay on a key oversight management report to the sponsors, to the stakeholders. You can't manage a project 2.5 years in arrears. It just, things get out of hand too fast.
Yeah, they do. And one thing that you guys both have alluded to is this fact that they had decided they wanted a highly customized, unique system. And part of it too, there's sort of two pieces of this project. They had sort of the back office ERP-ish sort of system or focus, and then they had the front customer or the citizen facing side of things where people could register their insurance and their sort of their license plates and all that stuff on a website. So it's sort of an e-commerce thing. So there's those two pieces of it. So they say they wanted a highly customized system, but then they chose SAP without any real due diligence. They just chose SAP. It sounds like they didn't do a full evaluation. They didn't define their requirements in any sort of detail. What's your take on that, Fred, as an expert witness and just as an ERP consultant in general? Clearly, that's not best practice, but what's your reaction to it beyond that?
Well, first of all, just obviously the presence of anti-corruption investigators makes this one extra spicy, right? We don't see that every day. So that made it interesting to begin with. But in terms of their preparation for it, yeah, according to the auditor's report, they did some very sort of surface analysis, and they were comparing two generic solutions, a custom build or an ERP in general. And unfortunately, they had an SAP consultant, it appears, doing the evaluation. So unsurprisingly, the chosen solution was an ERP. And then even less surprisingly, the chosen solution was SAP after that. What's interesting about this is it might have been one of those fairly rare situations these days where a lot of custom development might have been the right answer, actually. A monolithic ERP implementation probably was not, because they all knew there would be a great deal of customization going in.
Yeah. That's a good point. It's right there. You're starting the project with totally misaligned strategies. I mean, you're saying one thing on one hand, you want a highly customized system, and then you go out and pick SAP, which is not meant to be customized. People customize it too much as it is, but it's not meant to be a highly custom developed system. If they wanted a custom system, that's okay. It's nothing wrong with that, but don't go with an ERP system, which totally conflicts with that. How about you, Marcus? What was your initial take when you noticed, or when you jumped into this case?
Yeah, I think it's really just the presence of, collusion, deception. I think there was an allegation of contempt of Parliament. There was a cover-up. There was an allegation that project status reports that were submitted to Parliament were modified to minimize, the red flags. And to me, I mean, that in and of itself is just shocking. Is that the level of the cover-up on the part of SAAQ is certainly unusual. And the allegations that there was some sort of collusion in the selection of the integrator and the software vendor is very interesting, and not something that you see often. So, I mean, from a legality standpoint, I think all of that is very interesting. I think if you take a step back, it's shocking to me that just you see this. That's certainly unusual, but the unpreparedness, the unsophistication of the auto insurance SAAQ company here in taking this project on is not something that at that scale that you see. And I think it's interesting that in some of the documentation that I looked at in preparation for talking to you guys today, there were allegations that their team was immature, arguably incompetent, unsophisticated. But that points the finger right back at the vendors as well. I mean, they're taking advantage of that situation, and they're the ones that you've got to look at too. I think here there's blame to go around, and I think it's going to be easy to point the blame at SAAQ, but you've also got to look at the vendors here that were just kind of taking the money and arguably taking advantage of the situation they found themselves in. I mean, you don't get to a $1 billion failure very easily, and
it doesn't happen overnight. It
No,
didn't just,
it does
they
not.
woke up one day and say, "Oh my gosh, we're at $1 billion. What happened?" This was a slow death by paper cut sort of thing that began way in the beginning. It began when, they had, after that initial discovery phase, when they started to get into the requirements and everything. Right then, they were already recasting the budget and everything. But to your point about hiding stuff, that's the part that's really interesting. Is it sounds like up the chain within SAAQ, it was sort of a CYA, like how do we cover our ass? How do we make things look better than they really are? And then when things started to go south, it sounds like they broke this into smaller projects, almost like to hide smoke and mirrors, like sleight of hand, to hide the fact that they were going over the overall budget. But they had these little mini projects. It was hard for the public or for the people responsible for overall at the higher levels to see what was actually happening. And so that's a sort of shame on both parties, really. I mean, you had the vendors to blame for sure between SAP and IBM. And to be clear, it was a division of IBM. I can't remember the name of it. Was it LGS?
Yes, that's right.
LGS. So it was a part of IBM that was doing the SAP implementation, but lots of blame to go around all around there. So Ron, I want to come to you for a second here. From a CIO perspective, when you've gone through these projects and you've got vendors that they're doing their own COIA at times too, right? Like I imagine in this case, SAP and LGS/IBM weren't 100% transparent, partially because they need to look good. They need to keep the client. They want to keep that revenue stream going. So to some degree, there's an economic incentive for them to hide some of the problems that inevitably happen in a project like this. But from your perspective, sitting at the client side of things, what are some of the early warning signs, or what have you done to sort of draw this out, to draw out the early warning signs in a project like this?
Sure. Great question. So I think three of the things that I try to do in larger scale projects is we put together a cross-functional steering team. I use sort of a steering team, core team, extended team construct. But that steering team is made up of the key stakeholders, the business process owners for whatever it is we're talking about. In the case of ERP, it's typically finance and human resources. I do that for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, I'm not the business process expert on any of that. I need their wisdom, their expertise, their knowledge about, is this going to work or is this not going to work? The other piece I do, and I've done this a couple of times with you and your team, Eric, is I want to have an independent third party help me assess, are we running into red flags early? Are we starting to see yellow flags? How do we make course corrections before they become showstoppers? I do that for a couple of reasons. I'm in the thick of it, so it's kind of like I can't see the forest because the tree's right in front of my face. So I need that third party outside perspective to say, hey, vendors saying this, we're seeing that, there's a disconnect here. We need to make sure everything's still good. And finally is, again, breaking up projects from the beginning, not 2/3 of the way through or however far into it you are, of saying, in this particular instance, this was going to be a 10-year program. That's not a 10-year project. In my way of thinking, that should be 10 one-year projects or something similar to that. That way, again, we're not trying to boil the ocean. We're focusing on deliverable 1, then we're focusing on deliverable 2, then we're focusing on deliverable 3. And again, managing risk, reducing risk, increasing transparency by having a third party, having the right senior stakeholders involved can help, but it's not a guarantee. The other thing to remember is the vendor is not in this because they want to help you. They're in this to make money. The billable hours is their incentive. And if you don't manage that, you end up in these large overruns extremely quickly. That's why you want to do the work up front, the 3 to 6 months of phase 0, I think the article called it. You got to define your requirements. You got to do the process work. You got to have the teams in place. You got to invest in that organizational change management construct so that you, the client, are the ones driving the consultant, not the other way around.
Yeah, it's a great point, and you bring up a bunch of good points as far as the economic incentive and how in this case SAP and IBM, their goal is to make money. And here's the interesting thing about digital transformations in general is that these are highly risky projects and highly costly projects for any organization.
Mm-hmm.
And the only parties that are guaranteed to come out okay on the other side are the vendors. They're always going to make money no matter what. And guess what? Their only risk is getting sued. And that is a risk, but it's not nearly as risky or common as a failure that can affect your operations for years down the road, on top of having budget overruns and time overruns and all the other chaos that goes along with that. So that's super interesting point. And I want to come back to a point that you actually mentioned in the CIO article here in just a second, Scott, but you make a point, a really important point in that article. I'm going to come back to it. But first, I want to just say hello to the audience here. We had a lot of people chiming in on where they're joining from. Michael on YouTube joining from Cleveland, Ohio. Thanks for being here. Ed joining from Texas, Dallas-Fort Worth. Thanks for being here, Ed. Someone from Montreal, Quebec, Canada on LinkedIn, although I can't see their name. They probably wanted to be anonymous because they maybe have something juicy to tell us about the what's going on the ground. And for whoever that is that's joining from Quebec, I'd love to hear your perspective. If are you noticing a service disruption as a citizen of Quebec, or what's the word on the street? I'd love to hear your perspective there in the chat. Oops, having an issue here. Hold on. I've someone joined on LinkedIn from Rotterdam, Stanislav, I believe it is. Matthias joining from Copenhagen, Phil joining from Columbus, Ohio. We've got someone joining from India, Spain, Denver. We've got people all over the world. So thanks for being here today. Really appreciate you all joining. A couple other people from Canada. Karen's in Ottawa, Canada. So thank you for being here today. So I'd love to hear in the chat too, by the way, as we're going through these questions, what do you think so far? What do you think the big challenges here were? What's your initial reaction to this? Because we're coming at it from our expert opinions or whatever you want to call it, but I'd love to hear your perspectives. And I'm sure many of you are experts as well. So I'd love to hear your perspectives in the chat on what your takeaways are here so far. So in the article, Scott, in the CIO article that was published last week, and this is actually the article that sparked this event, this live event that we're doing right now. You were quoted in there and you made a comment that's super interesting that I feel like is really under discussed. And it's not something that's very commonly discussed amongst us experts in the industry. And that is this concept of decision latency. And you talked about how decision latency can create problems in this case, but in general can create problems on digital transformations. I totally agree with the point, but I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, what's really interesting is one of your previous podcasts some time ago where you had Hans Mulder on from, and was talking about the research that they had done at the Standish Group. I linked in with Hans and he sent me over one of their reports and it was amazing how critical, like even more important than the quality of the decisions you make, the speed at which you make decisions is the real driver as to whether your project has a chance for success. I think the logic behind that is, if you fail fast, right, you can recoup and you can change those decisions and you could do it fast before you get too far down a rabbit hole, the way I would phrase it. And it really also ties back to a lot of what Ron was talking about in terms of the setup on these projects, right? So if you don't have the right internal team structure and the right governance structure set up, then you really don't have a chance to make good or fast decisions in any organized manner, right? And to the point about the vendor, I mean, if you go to a mega vendor in this space, especially in the ERP space, we kind of characterize the vendor as one entity, and it's not. You're dealing with a sales team, and that sales team is incented on selling you a solution. So they're going to of course speak to the high level requirements and the if you haven't done the due diligence to really get down into a granular level to put them on the spot to say, is your solution really going to be able to handle these types of unique requirements for a municipality? And, have you done this before? And, any type of vetting, they're going to sell you the solution and say, yeah, our solution's highly configurable. We could do anything for you. And so you put all of those things together, and then the last point Ron made was the not having that technology agnostic third party in there. That is what levels the playing field, right? That's what allows you to, how often do you do these projects at this scale as an organization? Once in your career, maybe twice if you have a full career in this space. So everything is tilted against the customer in this case. And so you pull all those three things together and you just don't have a chance to make decisions quickly, and you don't have a chance to course correct. I've experienced this in my past life. I've had, great teams where we were well organized and able to be fairly adaptable and flexible and agile. And then, other instances where, projects just get paralyzed and decisions go to die in some executive committee. And the next thing you know, what happens is when you don't make those decisions fast and with confidence and decisiveness, you start to sow doubt into the rest of the organization, and then decisions just start to stack up on one another, and you really get yourself into a quagmire.
Yeah. And I think on top of that, it's helpful to maybe show in a slow motion an example of how that plays out, what you just described. So let's just say I'm a consultant. I come in, I work for IBM. I'm an SAP consultant. I come in and I say, okay, this is my team right here. I'm having a workshop to make some decisions around how we're gonna configure the software. And in my project plan, I assume we're gonna have this workshop today, and then tomorrow I'm gonna start configuring. But what happens typically is you come to this workshop, we have a discussion, and we can't decide because either we aren't all on the same page, or you need to go talk to your team. You're uncertain of, whatever it is. You're uncertain of what the decision should be, and we don't make a decision today. Maybe it takes us a week to get the right stakeholders together to make the decision. So now, instead of me starting the configuration tomorrow, I have to wait a week. But as a consultant, I'm not going to say, okay, pencils down, stop the meter, turn the meter off. I'm going to stop billing. They're going to keep billing. So they're billing while they're sitting around billing while you're trying to make a decision. And that's just one small example, but you add that up hundreds, thousands of times throughout a project. Now all of a sudden you're talking about, a 2-year project becoming a 3 or 4-year project, and a $100 million project turning into a $300 million project. That's how it happens largely.
So an interesting statistic out of that chaos study was they estimate that there's one decision to be made per $1,000 in expenditure per in labor, right, and third-party labor. So you take 1,000 times 100 million times 500 million, or however much proportion of that spend is in labor. I mean, you start to stack up thousands of decisions, and these could be really small decisions. They could be really big decisions. But to your point, if you don't have a mechanism by which people have authority and are empowered to make decisions, and without having to have everything go all the way up the stack to the executive level, then you get completely paralyzed very quickly. Quickly.
That's a super interesting stat, and I was not aware of that. So one decision for every $1,000 spent on a project.
Yep.
Yeah. And thousands of decisions, and some of those are easy decisions. I imagine some of them are really meaty decisions, like how are we going to run our business? Or, here's a conflict between way software works, way business works. What are we going to do? And
I think something in this report said there was like 47 legacy systems that they were trying to deprecate and pull together. I mean, forget about everything else. Just that alone would yield 10,000 decisions. I mean, that's an insane scope to try to take on at one time.
Yeah. And you're also touching on, I want to ask you this about this, Fred, this concept of phase zero. We talk about it a lot here at Third Stage, and it's becoming more and more commonly discussed in the industry, but this concept of phase zero is what we're talking about, really. That's what we're getting at, as sort of a solution here, which is you're going to have to make the decisions. It's not that these decisions get any easier or that they go away. It's about when you make the decisions. Do you wait until the meter's running and the cash is just accumulating, that the spend is just burning up cash? So tell us a little bit about phase zero and how that might have affected this if they would have done a proper phase zero.
Well, first of all, they might have gone a different direction with regard to solution. And I don't just mean the software provider, I just mean the philosophy. They might have gone with different point solutions and a lot of custom development, integration, and so forth. Just feels like from a little bit we've read about this, that might have been a better approach here, although I can't say for sure. But once you had determined the approach you want to take, One thing that struck me is something we see all the time. They didn't do any requirements work. They relied on the client for deliverable 2, which involved driver's licenses and registrations, among other things. They relied on the client to document as-is processes. And it took them a long time, right? Well over a year after the contract was executed. And one of the common things we see in expert witness cases is that the provider assumes they can do requirements discovery in elaboration. They assume 98% of the requirements discovery is going to be done in a little bit of elaboration instead of doing upfront work. And this is a common problem. I see, and for going on for several years, I see practitioners simply not doing any sort of requirements analysis work up front and just assuming, sort of hand-waving away the complexity. And in this particular case, the auditor said the requirements around driver's licenses and registrations were grossly minimized, and that's primarily what led to the budget overruns. And we do see this phenomenon happen a lot. It's easy for the practitioners to kind of hand wave away the complexity and assume they'll figure it out as they go. And that rarely works. It's an excuse not to do any work, honestly. And I see it too often.
Yeah. Yeah, great point. I'm going to come back and get Marcus and Ron. I've got a follow-up question for you here in just a second, but want to turn to the audience here real quickly. Again, we've got Fernando joining from Lima, Peru, beautiful part of the world. Thanks for joining. HW joining from South Africa, Ness joining from Los Angeles. HW on YouTube says, seems there is a universal defect. Could be. Although I think, to be honest, I think the potential defects in the system were probably the least of the problems here because I think some of those defects may have been self-inflicted, and there's all this other stuff that seemed to play into it. And again, I apologize, I don't know this person's name, but the person joining from Quebec came back with a response of, well, how does it look? What's it like now? So this is the perspective of someone living in Quebec and how it's affected them. So they say, yes, initially, yes, there was a big disruption in services with impact of a couple of months. Nowadays, the platform is working really well, and you can access information about your own license plates, vehicles registered under your name, and you can do changes. The other day, I had to request a license plate change and was able to do it within just a few clicks, paid the money, and got the template in less than a week. So it sounds like the system's working okay. Now, I guess the question is, was it worth $1.1 billion, and was it worth all the heartache that led up to where you are today? I mean, that's always the $1 million question. If you can get to the other side, great, but what's the collateral damage along the way? Some other comments here. HW on YouTube says, seems there is a deficit in outcome-based and stage gate governance models. This is a really good point because, Marcus, I guess from your perspective as an attorney, when you think about when to move on and to say everything's okay, so let's move on to the next stage of the project, let's move on to the next phase, how does that factor into some of these cases from a legal perspective?
Well, those are always critical, right? I mean, what you don't do, and what happened here is they rushed to. It looks like they rushed to a go live. I mean, I think some of the documentation suggested that they had only completed 20% of the testing that they should have, and they ignored red flags and went live anyway. I mean, you certainly can't do that and expect success. So I think, from a contractual governance standpoint, you want to have a framework put in place that dictates milestones, deliverable deadlines, testing requirements, what happens when deliverable testing doesn't work, what is the vendor or the integrator obligated to do. You want to have all of these things detailed with a very high level of specificity. But if you don't spend this time in this phase 0 that we were talking about a little bit ago, you don't have the tools to be able to do that properly. I mean, you've got to put the work in on the front end to make sure that you have the data, the information, the requirements to be able to govern that project throughout the life cycle of that project. And if you don't do that, I think you're really just going to set yourself up for failure. And, who's to blame for that? Well, I think the blame, there's enough to go around, as I said before, but certainly, I mean, a customer that is not doing the initial due diligence, that is, hiring their friends, which may have happened in this case, and then covering up, the collusion, that is a recipe for absolute disaster. And I think that's what you got here. And we understand from the person in Quebec that it's working, fairly well today. But like you said, I mean, what's the consequence of that? And I think government investigations, criminal liability, it's all waiting for these people. So
yeah. That's a great point. I want to come back to actually a couple of conflicting comments here that maybe, Ron, you could help us sort out a little bit here from a CIO perspective. So, and they're not necessarily in conflict. They're just two different opinions that need to be reconciled at times. So Kenneth on LinkedIn says decision frameworks are needed, empower teams to make decisions. And it sounds fair enough. But when I put it up against this question, this is where I wanted to get your take, Ron. This is from someone totally different. This is from Michael on YouTube. Says the challenges are that we are in the environment of no transparency. As businesses, we look to integrators as experts, and the integrator's motivation is to make revenue. My organization is failing. So on one hand, yes, you need to empower teams, you need decision frameworks. But on the other hand, when I say we, if I'm you, Ron, we're not the experts. We run a government agency and government entity. We don't do this for a living. You do, Mr. or Mrs. Consultant. So how do you reconcile that? How do you empower the team, but at the same time have ownership of the team when you're not an expert on this stuff? How did you find that right balance in your experience so far?
It's not easy. I'll give you that much. It's a challenge. I think there are two, maybe three key ways we approach this. I approach this. One is at contract and sales level. If I know that I'm taking on a project that my organization may not have expertise in, then I want to do one of two things. I want to find another consultant, a third-party consultant that has that expertise that can help me ride herd on what's going on, or alternatively, put that onus on the contractor who's doing the implementation. Say, look, you are the expert. In contract, I'm explicitly saying it's your job to make the right decisions, to let me know what has to change to make that transparency. Without that, it will not be in their boilerplate contract. It's just going to be, we're going to bill you monthly and you're going to pay within 15 days and yay, let's go. The other side of that is, it's really easy to say, well, I can't see what they're doing. I don't know what they're doing. But then that comes back a little bit on me as a CIO for my organization of saying, well, if I don't understand what's happening, how do I ever be successful at managing this? I need to make sure I understand. I need to make sure that the consultant, the implementer, explains it to me in a way that I can get it, that my fellow leaders in the project can get it, and we can explain it to our key stakeholders, our board, our electeds, whatever it might be. So it's, again, it comes down to, if you're not really clear on what you're trying to get to, sort of like if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. That works, but again, you run into lots of cost exposure and litigation exposure and things like that. So make sure your contracts back up any weak areas you feel you might have. If visibility is one of them, build that in. Bring in a third party, build it into your contract, whatever that might be, so that you have the visibility, you have the levers you can pull on the project to say things are good, things are not good. And one thing I think our attorney was mentioning is, don't ignore those yellow flags and red flags. When somebody says there might be a problem here, assume there is, dig in and figure it out. Do that as fast as you possibly can and as thoroughly as you possibly can. Most of the time it will end up being nothing super bad. Occasionally it will be, but you want to catch those surprises when they're as small as possible so that you don't end up, on the cover of magazines like this one.
Right. It's great. It's great advice. And for Michael and others that might be questioning where they are in their project, I'm going to include a QR code right here, top left side of your screen. I'll include a link below in the description of this podcast. But if you want a assessment from experts like Fred, myself, others from Third Stage, feel free to scan that QR code. We actually do free assessments for organizations that are looking for a second opinion or just sort of a gut check informally. There's no cost to it, just to get a feel for what some of those red flags might be. Because I think if you go through these projects and you're seeing all green on the status reports, even if it's day one of the project, I'd say something's wrong. You've got to have yellow or maybe even red. It's not bad, by the way. If you've got red on the status report, okay, that sucks, but at least you know it and you can address it. You have time to tackle it. If you push it off and your vendor's saying, hey, it's all green, everything's fine, and they're sweeping stuff under the rug, you've got to ask tough questions. Like if you've got to, not because you want to be overly skeptical either, by the way, but you do need to be a bit skeptical and say, I don't believe that everything could possibly be green, because guess what? These are really hard projects. They're very difficult. They're very risky. No matter who you are, no matter how good you are as an organization at leading change, it's going to be challenging. So that's super interesting. And so you having a agnostic, and I know this is going to be a plug for Third Stage and Infotech as well. Third Stage and Infotech, Marcus is obviously tech agnostic, but having tech agnostic providers that can take a look with a fresh set of eyes that aren't getting paid by the software vendors, that's really important. Because if you're the only one, if you as a client are the only one that your consultant is making money off of, then they're going to represent your interest, not necessarily that of the vendor. So I think that's an important thing. So I'll leave that QR code up here if you'd like an assessment. And we actually have a number of free assessments we do for organizations throughout the world. So feel free to scan that if you'd like to learn more about it or register for that. So Marcus, I want to come to you on this point, the same point around, because I know you talk a lot about this in cases that you're involved with and you and I have worked on together. This whole concept of, hey, we're not the expert, but the expert is here and they're telling us what we need to do, and we believed the vendor, and therefore it's all their fault when this project fails. What's your reaction to that, or how do you assign blame in this case?
Well, I mean, I think it's critical in these contracts that you really have to identify that vendor or that integrator as an expert. You hired them for a reason, and they're the ones that do this every day. They make their living doing this, and the life cycle of these projects is so long that the likelihood that anybody in your organization has done more than one or two of these is probably small, right? Unless you're hiring experienced people for these skill sets. They're managed kind of on a part-time basis by subject matter experts. And I mean, you really need to put contractual language in not only the consulting agreement, the MSA, but those statements of work. And there's always assumptions provisions in these statements of work. And the form contracts that you're going to get from your integrator are going to put all of the responsibility for the success of that project onto you as a customer. And you have to push back on that. Certainly there's dependencies, right? You've got to make these decisions quickly. You've got to provide the right access, the right information to them, but it's not that one-sided. And I think there's got to be some sort of a balance here, because if you have a bad contract and you get into a situation like this, you have no dog in the fight. You have no recourse. They will know it, and they'll walk all over you. And I think the likelihood that these things are going to fail is really high, and the likelihood that you're going to end up in litigation, while not as high, it is still there. And if you end up in litigation with a contract that doesn't protect your interests, you really aren't going to get very far. And that's not a good position to be in. Out millions and millions of dollars on a failed project and then without any recourse is not where I want to see my clients.
Yeah. How about you, Fred, as an expert witness, which, by the way, just for those that don't know what an expert witness does, an expert witness would be someone like Fred, who's below me on the screen, working with Marcus next to him, who's an attorney. Attorneys are there to assess legal liability and to make their argument for their client, whether it's plaintiff or defense. Expert witness, Fred, on the other hand, is someone who's the expert that comes in and analyzes the facts of the case. What happened? What went wrong? What's your opinion on why the project failed? And then Marcus would go to take that to court and say, look, our expert witness said this, and that. Therefore, here's whose fault it is. But tell us a little bit from, as an expert witness perspective, what's your take on assessing blame? Is it in this case, how much of it, how would you determine whether this is all SAAQ's fault, whether it's all SAP's fault, whether it's all IBM's fault, or some combination of all the above?
It's fairly clear it's everybody's fault in this
Right,
case.
it is.
It's more a question of ratios than anything else at this point. How you would assess blame is we can see symptoms from the auditor's report, right, that are pretty glaring. And we've all been involved in projects like this. And so we can intuit probably what happened or likely what happened to cause them. But if you're really going to investigate this, the best evidence is contemporaneous evidence from when decisions were made, right? It's email conversations and meeting recordings and things like that, where you can actually see the problems developing, the rationalizations developing, the explanations developing, and so on. That's the kind of
Oh, we lost him.
Lost Fred.
Yeah, let me add him back here. There we go.
There he is.
Sorry about that.
Right.
I don't know what happened there. Once you get to even status reports contain narrative setting and so forth, and they basically just point you back and make you suspicious before you to look for other evidence. By the time you get deep into a case and there's depositions and so forth, depositions are a lot of fun to read, in my opinion, but there's a lot of narrative setting and selective memory, and memories have faded. And again, what they really do is just point you back and tell you, I think I'll look for evidence to back up this or that. Going through emails is really the best way to assess the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, one thing where I would say in this case, SAAQ has a heavy dose of blame to take is the lack of planning and preparation up front. Because if you let the fox into the hen house, so to speak, too soon, then okay, the fox came in the hen house and killed all the hens, whatever, killed all the animals. The fox, shame on the fox, but shame on you for letting the fox in too soon. And so, in this case, if they would have taken the time to do due diligence up front and to do phase zero, and for those of you that are wondering what phase zero means and the things that we mean by phase zero, download this checklist right here. QR code, top left side of your screen. We'll include links below. But if you scan that checklist, that gives you some guidance or things to think about that you should be doing during the project. And I would guess if SAAQ were to go through this checklist here, we'd probably find that they didn't do a lot of that. So, coming back to you, Marcus, what are your thoughts here? Fox guarding the hen house. How does that factor into these cases, and how does it affect legal liability? In other words, is it if I let the fox in the hen house, I bring in the vendors too soon and I haven't done my own due diligence, and then the vendor takes advantage of me? Is that my fault or is it their fault? Is it both? Like, what's your take there?
Well, I think somebody said it a little bit ago. I mean, there's fault everywhere, right, for doing that. And I think that's to your point. But from a legal perspective, certainly, I mean, if you've got someone that's motivated by the billable hour that is basically running your project and managing it for you, with very little input from you, that is a recipe for disaster. And that is a common theme in the lawsuits that we will litigate, where the customer didn't take on enough responsibility, they didn't have enough due diligence on the front end, and they really did rely on that vendor to manage that project, to figure out what the requirements are. And it's easy to point the blame at a customer for doing that, but you have to understand that these projects are sold by salespeople that are motivated by getting the revenue into the company, meeting their goals, going to President's Club, whatever it is, and they are notorious for minimizing the complexity of these projects, minimizing the length of the project, telling you that they've got industry best practices baked into this, that it's going to be smooth, and you have to look at that with a high level of skepticism. I mean, if somebody is telling you, "Hey, this is going to be easy. We can do this within months. This software is designed for your industry. It's incorporating all your industry best practices in there." It's just not true. It just isn't. And you've got to push back on that. And I think a lot of people don't do that, and they take that at face value, and then that perpetuates the problem because you think, "Oh, this is going to be easy. I don't need to devote as many resources as I thought I was going to because I'm on this fast track to implementation, and we'll just sit back and let the vendor do what they do." And now you're in a multi-million-dollar failure.
Right. And go ahead, Ron.
Sorry, I just wanted to tag on to what Marcus was saying there. That comes back again to, I think, we can't, as the clients, just say, "Here, consulting firm X, it's your job, go do it, tell me when it's done." They will do that. They absolutely will do that. They're more than happy to send you invoices monthly. That doesn't give you and your organization any time to A, understand what's changing about your business process, and B, prepare for that change and bring the organization into readiness for that kind of major change in your business. So now you've got the solution. Let's just assume they do it right and it's absolutely perfect, the best solution ever possible. But you got an organization who knows nothing about, again, set yourself up for failure in that we do things the older way. We're trying to learn how to do it the new way. It's day zero. We're going live. We've got customers and we don't know how to do it. You've got to, again, bring the organization and the project together and bring them along at more or less the same speed, so you don't end up with that huge disconnect in human capability versus technical capability.
Yeah. Go ahead, Scott.
I was just going to say, I mean, all of that is, Marcus and Ron just said is spot on. I mean, 100%. Here's what is amazing to me, right? So knowing that there was just this vacuum of preparation, basically, like whatever was done during that year was probably more bureaucratic in nature than, really functionally or technically deep and focused on what the solution should be. I can envision high level scope statements or, outcomes that they wanted to realize, but not really any analysis of how to get there. So you go through, there's like a couple phases of this project. The first phase was called like delivery 1. And it looks like that was installation of basic finance, admin, and HR functionality. So and it looks like they sailed through that. So my guess is that's just out of the box. Let's install this baseline ERP functionality. And delivery 2 is where you start getting into the bespoke custom requirements around the actual functional solution. And what's amazing is within like a year, they ran through and ran over the full budget for kind of that delivery 2 development phase. And at that point, that was in like 2020. So, at that point you had a raging red flag waving in front of you. And instead of, and this is where the whole concept of this sunk cost fallacy comes into play, and people get caught up in, the politics and the culture and the outside, viewpoints of how you're going to be viewed if this is a failure. Well, the project had failed at that point. Basically, that was an abject failure. But instead, they doubled down. They went back for more money. They did it in a way that they didn't have to go all the way to the top of the hierarchy for oversight and approval. And all of a sudden, the status reports, you were talking about status reports earlier, earlier on, they were like red and yellow, and there was, it was a rainbow. Then they went green for 3 years straight. And so I just had voices in my head with, I could picture being the customer and the vendors telling me, don't worry, we'll catch up. We'll be able to get there. It'll be okay. It'll be okay. And it's like green, green, green. And it was just digging the hole deeper and deeper and deeper. And so, okay, great. Mea culpa, you totally missed the boat on preparation. You should have invested, 1 or 2 years and $25 million in getting it right and understanding what you needed to do for data remediation and integrations and functionality and figuring out how to build it and how to select vendors and the whole 9 yards. You had a point a year and a half in to say, hey, this is a complete debacle. We dropped the ball. And I think that's the key point of demarcation, where when you get into the outside investigations, they're going to really hone in on that. And they're going to say, who decided to keep going and where did we starting to hide stuff?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And there's so many, organizational and human behavior dynamics that go into this. I mean, it's a lot of times, even though we opened up with the whole corruption, fraud, the dramatic result here, but it usually in these cases, even the biggest failures we've seen, usually the intentions are good. It's just that they've made some really bad decisions along the way, and the economic incentives and the human behavior, the CYA mentality kicks in. I guess, Ron, I'd be curious to hear from you. As a CIO, a lot of times you've got a bullseye on your back. You're going through a project like this, and it's like, if this project fails, Ron, it's on you. You're the CIO. Have you felt that before? And if so, how have you navigated that in your career?
Absolutely. I felt that every time we take on one of these projects. That's why my joke about CIO, it doesn't stand for Chief Information Officer. It stands for career is over. But
It's a great line.
you always have the target on your back because inevitably these projects are perceived as technology projects, right? I claim they're all business projects with a tech component, but nobody else sees it that way. I think the only way I've been able to handle it, and sometimes not as well as others, is you have to make sure you have the business owners, your peers, in the project with you. Because again, you don't know what you don't know about their business process. They need to have that input, that visibility, that expertise, that skin in the game, so that when decisions need to be made, they already have the background information leading up to that. They're able to process the information you're giving them now. They're able to make the decisions relatively quickly and have it be a relatively high chance of being the quote unquote right decision. If you're trying to bring in your VP of insurance in this particular case, and this is the first time they've encountered any information from the project, you have to bring them up all that way. Whereas if you've been having at least periodic status reports written, they've attended various status meetings, not every month, maybe quarterly, whatever it might be, but at least they've got some familiarity with what's going on. But at the end of the day, it comes back to the client organization of saying, we wanted to do this. We're having issues. How do we fix it? How do we contain it? And if it is deemed a quote unquote failure and we need to stop, then let's make that decision quickly. Let's not wait 2 years, 5 years, 8 years down the road. Let's make those decisions. As they say, fail fast, right? So that you minimize the bleeding and you get to a point where we can regroup and we can fix, or we can say, hey, that was just a bad idea.
Yeah.
The idea of having though your business partners with you as a CIO in that conversation is absolutely crucial, because I think somebody mentioned earlier selective memory. They'll all want to say, oh, that was an IT project and we had nothing to do with it, and yeah, fire him. So.
Right.
Eric, I pick up on something that Marcus said earlier. There's one consistent theme we see when we see bad projects is that customers didn't raise a red flag soon enough. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Most of them are psychological and emotional, I think. But we consistently, they don't object early enough, and they don't understand the appropriate escalation paths within the contract. And consequently, there's a lot, if you do wind up in litigation or arbitration, there's a lot of fuzz as to, well, you never told us you were unhappy. You kept paying the invoices. Yeah, but there was a meeting on May 3rd where I said I was unhappy. Well, where are the notes for that? And so on. Really always encourage customers to know those key escalation paths, and raise your hand if something doesn't feel right. And actually, don't be afraid to stop the project. As Scott, to your point, no one does that. Right. And you really need to. It's that sunk cost fallacy at work. And there's a certain amount of emotional blackmail that providers will do. They'll say, well, if you pause the project, I can't promise you'll get the same team back. Well, why would I want this team back? I'm stopping the project because it's a catastrophe. Right. Yep. So don't fall prey to that.
Yeah. It's a great point. And they're really good at, the better you feel, the more likely you are to keep the project going, keep the status quo, keep paying the invoices. But feeling good is different than being logical and rational and moderately skeptical, and owning the project too. Really, a lot of this comes down to ownership. I mean, you have to know that, look, this isn't going well. And I know you, Mr. or Mrs. Vendors, are saying that I should keep going as is, but I'm not going to. And we're going to call a timeout. We're going to reassess. We're going to revisit, that sort of thing. I want to get to a couple...
What we don't know either is, okay, they've got the system to a point of minimal viable functionality, but you can read in the report where certain of the expected drivers of ROI, I think something called twin billing, was supposed to deliver $246 million in ROI, was completely omitted late stage in the project. You don't really know what kind of glue guns and popsicle sticks this thing's functioning on today, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it could be quite fragile. And you look at the testing right at the end, and you can see where they were accumulating defects faster than they were fixing them, and they still went live without addressing critical testing from an end-to-end basis. I mean, they have multiple stages in this project to, kind of, in the Kanban world, stop the line and take some different approaches.
Why do you think, Fred? Why do you think they went forward with it? That's a great point that Scott just made. But we've seen this a lot in expert witness cases and other project failures that will help recover. It's just sort of like you plow ahead, you jump off the cliff and go. I mean, what is it that leads to that?
I don't know. I can't tell exactly what the problem was here, but in other cases, we've seen the pressure from the vendor. There's definitely a deployment philosophy out there in ERP that says, just put it into production and we'll clean it up later, right? This sort of crash landing approach philosophy, which is extremely painful operationally, obviously, to the organization. That might have been the philosophy here. Sometimes, frankly, it's just fear and shame on the part of the program management and sponsorship. We don't want to admit to our superiors that we're late again. We're going to have to reschedule again, move the deadline again. It's embarrassing. I might lose my job. That might have been the case here, too. In this particular case, we've got clues, at least, that the upper management of the agency didn't like to receive bad news, right? There's clues in the auditor's report that internal auditors who tried to raise red flags in 2023 were treated pretty abusively by the CEO. So maybe that's an indicator it wasn't the kind of organization you want to convey bad news up the chain.
Yeah, it wasn't. Criticism.
I was just going to say that for that last point, Fred, that's pretty huge. And something that I experience frequently in our interaction with clients is, we'll be dealing with, let's call them boots on the ground line managers that, are maybe a level or two levels away from the C-suite where the decisions are being made and driven. They can oftentimes see the train wreck from afar getting ready to happen. And they're struggling, right? Because on one side, it's like, I have my job. I can't go and completely rattle the organization and make a fuss, but I also want to do the responsible thing and give fair warning, right? And so there is a level of abstraction above that. There's a number of things that could be driving the reasoning for these decisions, but it seems like a lot of times the middle management is unable to have accessibility. Yep. And, to be able to speak openly and be heard, which could really, head off a lot of these disasters, or allow the organization to course correct in a way to get to a better result with, versus the approach that they are currently taking.
We do see that pattern an awful lot. There's people within the organization, either in the IT organization or people in business areas who've been through significant projects before in other jobs, and they'll raise doubts and realize it's not a safe environment for pursuing those doubts. And in this case, they actually had a governance structure put in place, one element of it that made sense. They had occasional drop-ins, it appears, from third-party consultants who would take a look at the project. And it appears from the auditor's report that these third-party consultants expressed doubts over and over and over again, and they were ignored. And so they had all kinds of opportunity, back to your point, to stop this thing and recalibrate it, and chose to ignore that advice, up to the point where they decided to plow ahead with going live, even though the testing wasn't complete and integrations hadn't been tested.
Yeah. And once you guys bring up a really good point, internal politics and culture can certainly affect these sorts of projects, and it has nothing to do with the technology. That's a much bigger issue, way below the surface of the iceberg. But, one thing that we've seen, Fred, and I'm curious, Scott, I don't know if you may not see it as much just because of your, we have different business models, but I'm curious to hear from the two of you. One thing I know, Fred, you and I have heard at third stage is, you go into a situation like SAAQ, we're independent, we're third party, we come in with our assessment and we point out the things that need to be fixed. And then you get the vendor, a lot of times they'll say, yeah, but third stage is independent. They're tech agnostic. They're not SAP experts like we are, even though we've done 1 million SAP projects. Okay, yeah, we're not representing SAP. We're not selling SAP, but we are SAP experts. But they'll create this perception that, well, they're independent, they're agnostic. We're the real experts in SAP, and we're telling you everything's fine. Have you, what are your thoughts on that, Fred? Or have you seen that before? And I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Absolutely. And the problem is never the specific technology being deployed. These are generic problems involved in implementing technology. And they're the exact same problems we've been struggling with literally since the 80s, I think, maybe probably before that, right? They're the same generic issues. we face again and again.
Yeah,
It has nothing to do whether it's SAP or Infor or whatever.
Yeah.
It's hey, trust me. You know, when I hear anything akin to that, then you know I need some backup, right? I you know in jest, I mean I was kind of reading through this report and I wondered, oh, okay, I wonder if at some point SAP came in with a rise proposal at, you know, the later stages of this thing. I mean,
Right.
it's like, you know, you've given the keys to the castle to the vendor, you know, and you would, you know, and I struggle to understand why organizations put that level of trust into their vendors, right? I mean, this is a business partnership, you know, and it's something that you need to make sure that you have your interests taken care of and looked at. And you cannot expect your technology vendor and your system integrator to help manage the business process mapping, the change management, the project management, everything that goes along with you know keeping these projects on track. And so yeah, I mean, frequently when you're hip deep into a project and you know whoever the vendor is tells you, you know, it's okay, we'll figure it out by the end. I have a sense that was something happening towards the latter stages on this project. You're like, I think to your point, Fred, the psychological pressure, right? You've spent hundreds of millions of dollars. You're in the middle of this project. You've got a lifeline. The vendor's giving you a lifeline. We'll get you there. It's okay. You know, very easy to take that and grab a hold of it. And I can't really, you know, I can really empathize with people in that position, facing those choices. It's not an easy position to be in.
Yeah, you need someone there on your team that can say, not tell you it's okay, we'll get you there, and lead you right through the landmine. You need someone that says, yeah, it's going to be okay, but watch that landmine. Let's go around it instead of walking right through it. And that's really the way we've got to view it. Here's a opportunity for a shameless plug for you and I, Fred. Someone on LinkedIn says, could an independent quality assurance in ERP be of help? Yes, in fact, funny you should ask. It can be, and in fact, I'll put up the free assessment QR code again if you want a kind of an opinion on any of this stuff. We're happy to do that for you with no charge there. And then a couple other comments here. Whoops, just lost the chat. There it is. Here's another question for, you know, we're talking a lot about an extreme failure. You look at this now and you say, obviously, this is a huge failure. I mean, for God's sake, the corruption police are showing up at our doorstep. Obviously, something's wrong. It was very clear this is a big, massive failure. But most failures aren't this big. I mean, most failures are like the bigger risk, I think, are those moderate failures, those ones that are super painful, bring the operations to its knees for a couple weeks, and then sure, maybe eventually everything's okay. But they didn't need to go through all that heartache and cost and risk and all that stuff. So Megan on YouTube says, what are the key things you've seen that's an indicator of where the project failed or started to fail, and at what stage do you see them most? So in other words, what are those indicators of failure other than the government, the anti-corruption squad showing up at your doorstep and people getting fired and sued and all that stuff? Assuming we don't want to wait until that point, how do you know prior to that there's failure brewing under the surface? What are your thoughts? I'll start with you. How about you, Marcus? I'll start with you since you see a lot of these train wrecks too.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see them when, you know, we do an evaluation. We use somebody like your team to do that evaluation, a deep dive into everything that's happened, and it's really, you know, I think where enough resources aren't devoted to the project. That's certainly one indicator that the project is at risk. I think unrealistic project status reports, certainly where everything is green. I think you were saying that earlier. You know, and one of the things that somebody said that resonated with me is, you know, when did you start hiding stuff, and whose decision was it to keep going forward? And there's always a tipping point, and that's a pretty good summation of where the tipping point is, right? It's where you understand that, you know, the resources that you have to devote to this thing to get it to just a minimally viable product, you know, that's kind of where you're at. And I think that's certainly, you know, an indication where this thing is not going where it should. It's going off the rails. That's when people come to me, and we tell them, you know, two things. We say, look, litigation is expensive. It's going to cost, you know, probably as much as you've devoted to the project to date to take this thing all the way to a trial, and the outcome is uncertain. And you should devote as much time and energy as you can to get this thing right-sided so that you have a product that ultimately works for you. And those are the two, directions that you're going to go. If you're faced with, I've lost confidence in the vendor, we can't keep going on, we can't keep throwing good money after bad, and if that's the decision, we can't keep throwing good money after bad, then I think, litigation and trying to negotiate a resolution and get a new vendor or a new product is one of the ways to go. But that's not an easy process. And I think, trying to get that product to get to work for you is usually preferable.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So Michael on YouTube says all the issues revolve around poor documentation, inconsistent project structure and approval process, change management, success or failure. So that's an interesting observation, and I tend to agree with you here. Here's a use case or case study that is not going to fit on the screen, but I'll read it anyway. This is from Ed on LinkedIn. Ed says, my company is going through a digital transformation, and he uses digital transformation in quotes, which I'm curious to, I think you're suggesting something here. The first thing I did was gather this subject matter experts and broke down our business model, then built a wants needs list to get a better view of what we need to get going. Based on this list, we went through an extensive vendor discovery phase to find the best fit for our business. We are currently in the early implementation phase of our new infrastructure, and this really helped our vendor understand our business in order to reduce the plan design phase and focus more on building constructing phase. So interesting perspective from Ed on LinkedIn. So thanks for that. And if you ever want to brainstorm ideas on your project, Ed, feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to chat with you about that. But that's interesting. And I think, one thing I'd say too, coming back to this phase 0 thing, and I'll put up our phase 0 checklist again in case you missed it the first time. The QR code will be on the top of your screen. But when you do that phase 0 and that preparation, that planning up front that Ed is talking about, a lot of times clients, and back to this human organizational behavior, a lot of times clients think, well, if I spend this much time doing planning and preparation, that's this much time that I lost on building all the stuff I need to build. So what if we just don't do that? We'll speed things up and we'll start now. And it's sort of like they feel like because it's taking this long to get to where you even start designing and building and touching and feeling and seeing stuff, they feel like they're delaying things. But what we find is when you spend the time up here sort of building that foundation and letting the cement dry, and then you go start building the house, it just speeds things up so much more. Whereas if you don't pour the foundation, you don't let the cement dry, and then you start building stuff. Okay, yeah, you did technically speed things up in the short term, but long term, the whole thing is going to come crashing down. So get the foundation in place, speed things up. It's actually going to cost you a lot less time and money if you take that time up front, as Ed is suggesting there. So that's a great point. So thanks for that, Ed. There was another point here about public versus private sector. Let me come back to that. While I'm looking for it, here's a comment from Kavina on LinkedIn. Hi, Eric and everyone. Thank you for this discussion. 100% Fred. This is an excellent point regarding ego, fear of reputation, being impacted, and reporting the truth to peers. And she liked your CIO comments, Ron, career ago. So you've struck a nerve out there. Where is it? Oh, here it is. Okay, so I don't see the name of the person on LinkedIn that's saying this, but this is a really good point, and I want to get into this. A common theme I hear from all of you in your thoughts is that you keep thinking with a private sector mentality. There's nothing against it, but here they were dealing with government. Different mentality, lots of politics behind, and also a lot of unionized people here that also don't want to change. And this is a really interesting point, and I'll start with you, Ron. What are your thoughts here? And I admittedly, I have more private sector experience. We do a lot of government work at Third Stage, but me personally, I have more private sector experience. I'm curious to hear what you think, Ron.
As someone who's been in the public sector for 20 plus years doing these kinds of projects, one thing, and both the private sector as well, the one thing that I think is extremely common across all of this is the larger the organization, the larger the project, the more political it is. It quite honestly doesn't matter as much as one might think, whether you're talking about a government project or a private sector project. The politics on the government side is different in that you're dealing with public money, taxpayer money generally. And so there's a little bit more emotional excitement attached to that on behalf of your constituents, as should be. And you're dealing with election cycles that honestly people in the private sector do not have to pay any attention to. That can exacerbate any of the issues that you might run into in a project. Um, to just address the union thing for a moment, I've been in private sector organizations where we had union issues. Yes, it's much more prevalent in government, but it's not exclusive to government. But that really gets, I think, to the point where it's part of phase 0 and it's part of your ongoing change management process. You have to include your bargaining units, your unions as key stakeholders, even though they may not officially be the business owner. They own the resources, for lack of a better word, that get your work done. And you have to bring them along just as much or even more than you have to bring along the individual people doing the work day to day. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to end up in litigation, having to call on Marcus to defend or take Marcus on. You also don't want to be in a situation where you've got labor issues. You've got a meet and confer. You've got a more contentious complaint that you have to deal with because you didn't include those kinds of things. So while I think it's true that government is a little bit unique, I think it's also more common than most people would realize and immediately appreciate. But again, getting back to that election cycle and the taxpayer piece, to me, that argues even more adamantly, more strongly for let's break this up. Let's take this in smaller risk increments, because when it goes bad, it goes really bad, really quick, and it's just a mess, and nobody wants to deal with that. If we can say we're going to spend, instead of $500 million as they started with, if we're going to spend $50 million and we're going to do these 1 or 2 or 3 things and see how that goes. If that works, great. If not, we'll adjust. Okay, now instead of spending 50 million, we're going to spend 45 million and we're going to try and do this one thing. Taking that 10-year window of project, as they tried to do, and breaking that into a program with multiple projects within it, I think in a government space is really the only viable way to manage that extra risk, that extra layer of risk.
Yeah, that's a great point and great way to put it. And you do, I think the bigger issue here is, it's really important to understand who you are and what you're dealing with. You're culturally, politically, organizationally.
Right.
And it's not just, are you public sector or private sector? Even within the public sector, within the private sector, you've got different cultures, different politics, different gamesmanship that's happening internally, and drivers and all that stuff. And that is a big part of what change management can help with. But honestly, you won't hear me say this often, but I feel like change management might have been the least of the problems here on this, just because there were so many things pre-change management that were just so fundamentally wrong with the project to begin with that I don't know that any amount of change management could have fixed this, which I hate to say because I love change management. I'm a huge believer in it, obviously, but I don't think that would have helped, but I don't think it would have fixed the problems here. I want to get to this. I want to get a knee-jerk reaction to this question because I have a very strong reaction to this, but I want to see what you guys think. And I'm gonna start with you, Fred, as a independent consultant, not only as an expert witness perspective, but also as someone who helps guide clients through the selections and implementations. But the question here is from Phil on YouTube. He says, "How do you select vendor number 2 after vendor number 1 fails?" What's your knee-jerk reaction to that, Fred? I just want to see what your thoughts are.
I think it's good to take a pause and do a brief retrospective on what went wrong. Be honest with yourselves on, if you're the customer, be honest with yourself on your complicity in the problem, right? What you could have done better, and learn some lessons from it, and then just apply those to another selection. I do agree, it may sound self-serving, but I do agree that you should bring in a selection firm or someone independent to help you guide that, to kind of take some of the emotion out of it. Whereas you might have been too trusting the first time around, now you're going to be too suspicious, right? That you're going to see monsters under every bed. So it's probably, I would bring in somebody to help guide you through that process, but learn lessons from the first time. Try to be dispassionate about it, and maybe take a break before you move into the second one. Let the dust settle a little bit.
Yeah, that was my thought too, is that's the last thing you should be doing, is saying, okay, well, let's go find another vendor. We had the very first expert witness case I was ever involved with was one that was very large, very well known, not quite as big as this one. I think it was like a $700 or $800 million failure, which is still massive and excessive. But in that case, they had the organization, it was a big manufacturing company. They tried to implement PeopleSoft, and they had a big, massive failure. and they went into litigation with PeopleSoft. They settled, and then they just went straight to SAP and said, all right, well, we've got two options. We're a huge company. We either, at this time, this is before Oracle and Microsoft D365 were really viable options at the time, or at least for larger organizations. So they said, well, we already tried PeopleSoft. Now I guess we're going to SAP, and they didn't do an evaluation. They just went straight to SAP. That led to the failure that they hired me as the expert witness for. And in fact, one of my points in the report was that they just went straight from PeopleSoft to SAP and did the exact same things over. And guess what? You changed the vendor, but it didn't change the results because you ran it the exact same way. In that case, unfortunately, the judge actually struck that part of my report. I couldn't talk about the PeopleSoft failure from the past because it was not related, in his opinion, to this case, but in my opinion, it was. But I think that's something you have to watch, is not just assume that the vendor's the problem and go find a new vendor and move on. So I want to do this just as sort of a wrap up here to sort of summarize and bring this all back full circle. I want to ask each of you, just what advice would you give to someone who's trying to avoid failure or remediate projects? What's that single, couple things that you would suggest that clients do if they're worried about failure, if they worry they might be failing or they are failing, whatever stage they're in? What can they do to mitigate risk and avoid situations like this? I'll start with you, Scott.
Well, I think a lot of the things we've already talked about, right? I mean, to me, the biggest thing that's overlooked is the upfront planning and preparation and factoring that into the total cost of ownership of the project. I think there's an enormous pressure when someone has this idea or they get an idea that's greenlit and they go to this funding committee with a high level number that hasn't really been vetted in detail. Instead, go and ask for, like Ron was saying, break it up into chunks. Hey, we want some money allocated to go through this planning and specification development process. Let's look at what our problem, statement is versus what the solution sets look like in the marketplace. What do those requirements really look like? What's it going to take for us to, really do the remediation phases before we even get to something where we're developing the solution in most cases? I think that, it's politically difficult to kind of push through because the pressure to start the project seems to be enormous. If you can forestall that pressure to start and take time to plan, your budgets are going to be, much more accurate. I think, if you have a really good planning process, maybe you need that 20% contingency over your budget because your things are going to change, requirements are going to change. There's always the unknowns. But if you're not doing that, you need to plan for 100 to 150% of your budget variance. And so you really need to think about, are you going to be around at the end of this project because your name's going to be associated with that overage. It's almost guaranteed if you don't do the planning, you're going to get hit with that.
Yeah. How about you, Ron? What's your takeaway, your summary advice, last words to the audience here from a CIO perspective?
As someone who's had to deal with this, don't skip phase 0. It is the absolute critical piece. To build on a building metaphor, you got to have your foundation in before you start putting up your walls and your roof and things like that. Without that, it doesn't matter what else you do. So phase 0 is absolutely critical. And I think the other piece, and this I've learned sometimes the hard way, you really do have to pay attention to the organizational culture, the organizational politics, for lack of a better word, and really build in ample time for change management. You may want to call it something different. Sometimes there's an emotional reaction to the word change management. But you've got to be able to bring the project deliverables forward at the same pace as your organization is able to absorb them. Otherwise, you get in the desert, we call it the flash floods, right? Because it rains so much the ground can't absorb it. You don't want to put your organization through that same process.
Good advice. How about you, Fred? What's your parting advice?
Certainly endorse everything said already, but I'd say a couple things. Raise your hand when you're feeling uncomfortable at something. Know the escalation procedures in the contract. I know that we probably like reading contracts more than most normal people do, but know the escalation path and use it. And don't compromise on your stage gate criteria. If you set up stage gate criteria that say you're going to complete all the testing successfully before you go live or go into UAT or whatever, do it. Don't compromise on those things. And the thing I say to a lot of clients when they find themselves in difficult situations is, I know you hired these people because they're experts and you're not, but trust your instincts. You're probably right.
Right. Yeah. Great advice. How about you, Marcus?
Well, it's really three things. And the first is have reasonable expectations. Know what you're getting yourself into. Don't believe the hype from the sales team and the vendors. Then I would say you've really got to document your business requirements. Anything that is critical and any kind of critical piece of functionality that is a reason for that digital transformation, or you engaging that particular company moving away from your legacy system has to be documented in the contract. And the final thing really is use that contractual negotiation process to put a good, solid contract that functions as a governance document for the life cycle of your relationship with that vendor, so that when something does go sideways, you can pull that contract out of a drawer. You can point to Section 5, Clause 3, and say, "This is what's supposed to happen. You need to do this. We need to do this," and understand the contractual escalation. So that to me is really giving yourself an opportunity for success.
Yeah, and if I'm being totally proactive in thinking about worst case scenario, I'm recording, especially the AI now, transcription services and technology record every meeting, especially in the sales cycle. I mean, if you record that stuff, document it. I had a client on this podcast, one of our clients, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, named Seth, and he was on, and he was talking about how he had over 1,000 recordings of every meeting that with the vendors, with us, as his consulting partner. He had it all documented, and he had recordings of it all. And I thought that's really smart. And they're nowhere near litigation. I mean, everything went fine, but not only does it help you manage the project better, but in the, God forbid, the case you end up in litigation, you've got all this stuff documented, and that's just going to help you, especially if you need to hire someone like Marcus.
It really does.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate you being here. And for those of you that want help, or you want, to bounce ideas off this, you've got 5 people here from different perspectives that can help. You've got Scott from Infotech, analyst firm, great firm, by the way. Not only do we partner with them, but we're a customer of theirs. And I think, Ron, you're a customer as well. And so I highly recommend checking out Infotech. They're a good alternative to some of the bigger, fluffier analyst firms out there. So be sure to check out Scott. Ron is a CIO for hire. So if you're looking for a CIO, he's a guy that's got plenty of battle wounds, and we've seen him develop some of these battle wounds. We've been side by side with him. So he's a good guy to talk to if you're looking for a CIO type. And then Fred Hessler, expert witness / consultant on the Third Stage Consulting team. He's someone you can talk to. Marcus Harris, the attorney at Taft Law, someone you can talk to if, God forbid, you need legal advice or help. Although I will say, Marcus, there's a need or a way you can help earlier during the contract phase and procurement phases. That's an area you help with, and that's probably a lot cheaper to hire you then rather than waiting until litigation. Would that be a fair statement?
That's right. There's an old saying, early legal advice is not expensive.
Yes.
Right.
Legal advice on the back end is incredibly expensive.
That's perfect. Well, good. Well, I appreciate it, guys. If you want an assessment of your project, scan it right here. And if we need to pull in one of these other guys too, we will. Or someone else from our team. If you're looking for just an informal sounding board for your project, feel free to reach out. Just scan the QR code and register for that. Thank you all for being here today. Really appreciate you running a little bit over here, guys. Appreciate the audience questions. Great participation. And really appreciate it. And hope you all have a great week. Take care.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.